What's up YouTube? So today we're looking at the new Roland GAIA 2 synthesizer. So full disclosure, they did send me this synthesizer, so I'm going to try to remain as unbiased as possible during this video. I'm just going to show you a couple of these sounds that I've been enjoying creating using the synthesizer and a couple of the techniques and how to create those sounds yourself. So yeah, big thanks to Roland for sending me the synthesizer, and I hope you enjoy the video. All that being said, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the video. Let's dive in and have a look. So something to note about the Roland GAIA 2 is that it essentially has like 4 modes of operation. You have preset mode, which just allows you to cycle through the entire bank of pre-made factory presets. Then you have user mode, which includes some of your own presets. It also allows you to kind of create a bank of favorites, which you can then also switch through very easily using these selectors over here. For example, the first 8 in your sequence selectors will be the bank, and then the next 8 will be the tone. So it allows you to quickly recall favorites and that kind of thing. If you do have like a set of favorites, most of the time I end up using the init mode, which is kind of like the sound designer's mode. It basically just initializes everything, allows you to create your own patches from scratch. And also the model mode, which essentially just turns the thing into a emulation of a Roland SH-101, which is a very legendary acid synth of theirs. You can actually download other models from the Roland website, or you can purchase extra kind of expansions and that kind of thing to add different models into the system. That being said, I'm pretty happy with both the init, which is like the 3 oscillators, wavetables, everything kind of mode, and then the just raw monophonic SH-101 style mode. So what I want to start off with is doing some kind of like acid lead using the SH-101 style system. What we can do is we can actually just press the model button twice, and then that'll actually pop up the preset menu on the screen. What we can do is then we can cycle through all the way to the bottom and open up an initial tone. So what this is essentially just a blank preset. One of the interesting things about the model of the SH-101 in the GAIA 2 and not the original was we actually have a set of extra effects, which are kind of emulating a bunch of the legendary Boss pedals at the time. And we can actually dive into the MFX over here, use the screen to actually cycle over to the MFX selectors. And here we've actually got the ability to cycle through various categories as well as the combinations, which is a bunch of legendary Boss pedal emulations. So here you can see we've got OD and chorus, and we can choose a bunch of different pre-made selections of pedals. We've also got JD multi, which basically turns the combinator, which is like 2 pedals, into 4 pedals, which you can then select down here at the bottom. So this is really cool because this is a really nice starting point to quickly just kind of throw in some effects, maybe a chorus and a reverb, and then suddenly your kind of initial tone isn't so raw and basic anymore. And this allows you a really nice starting point to start kind of crafting sounds around. So what I also want to do is just enable the chorus, and we can just use some of this send reverb over here. What I want to do is quickly just jump back into the menu. We can cycle over to the reverb, and we can just choose a type of reverb that we want. So again, you can select from a variety of models of Roland reverbs that are in here. We can also use some delays and all sorts of things like that. I'm just going to choose a simple Integra 7 reverb, and then we can choose the amount of wet using this knob over here. And you see suddenly the sound that we have here is not just a kind of basic square wave anymore. It's kind of got a little bit of that reverb and stuff, so it's not so kind of basic anymore. Okay, so now we can actually start sound designing the patch a little bit. If we go back to the initial menu over here, so we could either sound design this using the parameters on the actual synth. So it's a bit confusing if you know an SH101 trying to apply some of the effects, specifically the oscillator section. The filters and the amps are a little bit easier because it's laid out very similarly. So often what I do is I'll go into the oscillator menu and actually assign a lot of these things manually, in the digital system. So for example, here in the mixer, we can choose the saw, sub-osc, noise level, and everything independently. So if we turn this down and we turn up the saw level, now we're getting a kind of default saw wave. And I want to add a little bit of sub-osc underneath. Cool. Okay, so now let's move on to the filter. Like I said, with a filter, it's a little bit easier to understand because it's basically just cutoff and resonance that we generally know. Do you know what I mean? So here what I want to do is I want to enable some envelope depth, and what this allows us to do is create some movement on the filter as we pluck the sound. So we could potentially record in a sequence, and how we can do that is we can press record and edit. And so now what this allows us to do is actually record in a sequence step by step, quite similarly to how we would on the original SH101. So let's just go. Now we can play that back. And now that frees up our hands to modulate some of these parameters. Okay, so now let's jump back into the effects and start to tweak these options a little bit here. So you see here how we have this JD multi. This basically consists of, I think, a phaser, distortion, ensemble, and something else. I'm not quite sure. But each of those pedals has its own set of features over here. And an EQ. Yes, that's what SP is. It's an EQ. So anyway, we can choose the type of distortion that we want over here. So let's apply a little bit of LFO to this cutoff to create some movement over the entirety of that bar, just again to like free up our hands for some of that modulation control. So how we can do that, if it's not already assigned, we can hold the LFO assign button. In fact, I don't want to do that on LFO2, let's do it on LFO1. We hold the assign button and then we turn the parameter that we want to assign. Then the LFO is automatically just assigned to that parameter. So here we could change the depth and the speed, and then it's going to automatically just turn this knob for us. That's what an LFO does, right? So let's say, for example, instead of the reverb, we want something like a delay. I think that could give us a bit better kind of acid sound, you know what I mean? So let's choose from one of these delays. I wonder if this can be synced. Yeah, that's pretty cool. let's say a 1/8 dotted, and then we can choose the wet level over here and the feedback. So the next sound that I want to talk about makes use of just the regular Gaia 2 mode, not the SH101 model. So how we flip back to that mode is we just press user, init, and then OK. And now we've basically initialized a preset in the traditional Roland GAIA 2 mode. So that allows us to make use of the wavetables and other features. So another thing I want to talk about that's really cool is the C and L pitch bend mode. It allows you to play a set of notes and then pitch bend just the last note that was played. And so this is a kind of way of faking a sound that sounds a little bit like MPE or a lot more expressive, where it's not just like pitch bending the entire chord up and down. So how we would do that is we would use the screen and the selector, and we would cycle over to the CTRL or control panel, and we would use this bend mode, and we would change it from normal to C plus L or C and L. And now what that allows us to do is play a bunch of notes. I'm actually going to use this hold parameter, so that allows us to and so we got this chord now, right? And notice how when I pitch bend, it's only going to pitch bend this last note which we played in the chord. I want to go back into that control panel, and I want to use bend range up of 1 and bend range down of either -12 or -2. That depends on your taste. I want to use bend range down of 12, so that way we can bend down an octave and up just one semitone. So we can get like this kind of effect. Okay, so that's basically just like a little bit on how we set up the patch to play it. Now let's create some sounds with the patch. So with this kind of thing, this kind of lends more towards creating pads and atmospheres and that kind of thing. So what we want to do is we want to start off by just maximizing the amplitude and release. So that means when we play a note, it's going to hold for a long time. While I'm sound designing the sound, though, I often will turn down the attack a little bit just to get it a little bit more immediate so we can hear it a little bit quicker. Cool. So we can start off by just adding a little bit of chorus by tapping that button there. We can jump in and actually edit the particular parameters of the chorus if we want to, going like this into the menu. I'm just going to leave it as is for now. Let's apply some reverb as well. See how that combination of the release, the CNL, allows you to like bend those last notes while it's releasing out to give you a really nice spacey effect. So, okay, back to the sound design parameters. What we can do now is we can start to shape the sound using the wavetable oscillator. So what I'm going to do is just turn down all of these. So all we're hearing is the wavetable oscillator. And then we can cycle through a bunch of the wavetables to find one that we think sounds the best. That kind of sounds nice. That little sweep in the beginning there. Kind of throaty. Okay, cool. So let's use this one. What I also want to do now is I want to create an LFO that's going to modulate this. But we want it to have a slightly different modulation phase for each of the notes that we play in the chord. And what that's going to do is that's going to further give us that sort of wide, almost fake MPE kind of sound, because it's going to sound like each of the notes is like its own synth. You know, it's going to be really wide and poly. And so how we do that is we go into the menu over here. Let's go over to LFO1. We want to put key trigger switch on, right? And so now every time the note is triggered, it's going to reinitialize that LFO cycle, right? And so let's now apply this to this by holding the assign button and then turning the position. And we can change the depth here. Notice how each of those notes now has its own kind of modulation phase. With these kinds of things, I often like to pitch them down quite a bit. To use more as like a texture layer. And then we can use a traditional oscillator, maybe use this unison oscillator as like a higher frequency layer. And then lastly, I often like to just put in a sine wave at a high frequency as well, just to layer in there to give it some higher harmonics. So now let's enable a filter, which we can use for some movement. One of the cool things here about having the NFX and the reverb, so basically the reverb is like a reverb and delay combo, but if we want like both, instead of selecting either or, we can use the MFX as like a delay, for example. So let's set this over to delay. We can choose something like the reverse delay is actually pretty cool for these kind of pad type sounds. Some feedback. You see, once you set it up like that, you kind of have the idea of one texture oscillator, one dissonant oscillator, because you can kind of shift this position to change the detune of the unison. And then you have one harmonic oscillator. You can kind of play with that mixer, like the levels of each of those oscillators, to kind of fade it in between a kind of more musical pad and a more kind of cinematic, detuned kind of techno thing. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that's about it for sound number 2. Okay, so the next sound that I'm going to create is again in the user mode. So we're not making use of that SH101 model. The core principle behind this sound revolves around a really cool effect that's built in here called a resonator. I'm sure you know what that is. So just to start things off, what we can do is we can actually set one of these oscillator 2 or 3 over to noise mode. So essentially just going to create us some white noise like this. The basis of this patch is to modulate the volume of this and the filter to a LFO. So if we turn this down and we assign an LFO to the volume, turn up the depth, we have something like this. So we have various shapes which we can choose from here, which are going to give us kind of like a variety of different grooves. We can even go over to step mode and actually punch in individual steps like an MSEG kind of curve editor. That's a little bit finicky and involving, so I'm not going to do that in this video, but you can feel free to dive in and create your own patterns and grooves. For this, we're just going to use the saw wave mode, so it creates like a downward ramp. And we can create our grooves by modulating this rate parameter like this. Okay, so what we also want to do is we want to assign number 2 to the cutoff. We can turn this down. We actually want to set this to band pass mode and turn the resonance up. And that's going to give us this kind of zappy sound. With this cutoff, I don't like to turn the depth all the way on the modulation. Let's go about halfway. And what that does is that now gives us a little bit of play on the cutoff. So that's how I usually end up playing the sound, is by just, triggering a note, letting it play, and then playing with the LFO rate and the cutoff like that. Cool. So onto the effects. This is where it really starts to shine. Let's go over to a filter, and in the type, let's choose resonator. So what this allows us to do is set a root note and a chord, and we can actually assign those here with control 1 and 2 for the MFX. So here, let's say, for example, set it to something like an F, and we can choose -7. Okay, so in the MFX menu, we actually have control for a low frequency cut for that resonator. We also have envelope mod depth, which basically changes the dynamics based on the envelope modulation. And then we also have a feedback amount. So we can turn this down to get less of the resonator, or up to get it to resonate a bit more. Depending on the style of thing that you want to go for. We also have a brightness control, etc., etc. So I like to couple this with a bit of this reverb over here. So let's go over to the reverb panel. Let's assign one of these reverbs. Let's say, for example, go with a shimmer in this example. What I actually want to do is I want to assign this LFO1, put it into a random mode, and then let's assign this to the rate, and then let's assign number 2 to the cutoff over here. And so now here we can actually modulate both of those settings so that we don't have to constantly be playing it, you know what I mean? You can also get like a dub tech kind of vibe going if we just change that reverb over for a delay. And also if we change this LFO shape to some of the other shapes, you can get a variety of different kind of movements. And remember, all of these oscillators, or at least just the one oscillator which is actually creating the sound, is a noise oscillator. So all of the musicality in this sound is actually coming from like the filter and the effects, which is a really, really cool, kind of more experimental way of creating these kinds of sounds, chords and that kind of thing. Okay, awesome. That's about it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Huge thanks to Roland for actually sending me this Gaia 2 for the purpose of this video. And yeah, let me know in the comments if you want more stuff on the Gaia 2. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.